Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of the Vicente Sotto lecture series for 2022. So we're so thankful that even despite the pandemic, nothing can stop culture and history. Please make yourselves comfortable as we prepare to enjoy another cultural feast. But before we begin, as usual, a few house rules for our audience, especially here in Zoom. Don't forget to make sure your mics are on mute to avoid any distractions. And throughout the entire course of this lecture. And second, please don't forget to answer the evaluation form that will be sent in the chat box towards the end of this program. So if you do that, then your certificate of participation will be sent to you via email after you have submitted that evaluation form. Again, the link will be sent in the chat box towards the end of the program. So hello again to our audience, even at this time in the morning. Oh, it's not that early, but still we have a lot of participants, and we have even more, I'm sure, in our Facebook live stream. So we'd like to say good morning to everyone. We will begin with a prayer, and it will be followed by the national anthem. All right, so let us now pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that despite the many challenges these past few years, we are still able to foster our love for culture and history and our love for this island, Cebu. And we are able to come together and further our study, our understanding, and our love for it. So we pray that today you would be with us. There are so many little things that we take for granted. And as even Odette has taught us. So we know, Lord, that we are really dependent on you, even for our internet connection, our electricity, and all things. So we pray that you would take note of our time together and that you would really bless it. It would be a wonderful program, a lively program, and you would be with the viewers, that they would be able to keep focus and that their interest will really be stoked. And we also pray for the speaker, Father, that you would really help this communication that is going to be happening between speaker and viewers. We pray all these things, and we pray that it would be indeed for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So, maayong hapon.
Ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiliw, ewas ng sinakalan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagatang tutok sa simoy at sa langit kong bangaw, ay hinatang tula, kawin sa pagkayang minamahal, ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nag-iindig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidinig, lupa ng araw ng walhagin pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya na pagkay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
All right. Maayong hapon kanatong tanan. Ay, sorry, maayong buntag. Okay. So, for the benefit of those who've only joined us now, the Vicente Sotto lecture series is a monthly lecture series on literary, cultural, and historical heritage of Cebu. So, for more than a year now, we've been hearing from esteemed researchers and writers, really so blessed, on a vast array of different aspects of Cebuano studies, from the pre-war Cebuano fantasy novel, to special research activities, the Cebuano Christmas traditions, local cinema studios, Cebuano poetry and history, and many others. Wow, so we have Maayong Gabi from Washington, D.C. How nice. Okay, so today we will be hearing from another esteemed writer who has authored many award-winning books, Cecilia Manguerra Brainard. Yes, even during my college years, I already knew her name because she was always mentioned in our literature classes. So it's wonderful to have her here today. But before we begin, to welcome us today officially and to open the program is the Deputy Director of the Cebuano Study Center, Dr. Bea Lastimosa. She just recently married, so her name has now become Lastimosa. So let's hear from Dr. Bea.
Good morning to our esteemed guest speaker and to all our participants. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this month's installment of our lecture series organized by the Cebuano Study Center of the University of San Carlos. Allow me to give a little background on the Cebuano Study Center and what we do here. The Cebuano Study Center is a center of research on all aspects of Cebuano culture. It functions as a special library to house source materials pertaining to Cebu, as well as the predominantly Cebuano-speaking areas in the country. It also functions as a research center devoted to studies pertaining to Cebu in the area of the humanities and the social sciences, and as a special office assisting in the promotion of Cebuano culture and the arts. Over the years, it has become an active instrument in encouraging and supporting research activities within the university in the areas of the social sciences and the humanities. In addition, it has become a model of its kind as a local regional research center in the country through its varied activities in the conduct and promotion of local regional studies. The Vicente Sotto lecture series is one avenue by which we do this. This monthly lecture series, which ran many years ago, has been revived under the direction of Dr. Hope Yu, with the goal of adding to the discussions on Cebuano culture, arts, and history. With these lectures, we hope to make the rich cultural heritage of Cebu more visible to the bigger public. And we hope to create venues where the public can join in the discussions with renowned researchers and experts in the field of Cebuano studies. Since reviving the Vicente Sotto lecture series last year, we have heard from different esteemed researchers who talked about different aspects of our history, culture, and local traditions. We are very, very honored to have the multi-awarded writer Cecilia Manguerra Brainard with us today, who will be sharing about how she created her mythical setting of Ubec, which she uses in many of her short stories and her three novels, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, Magdalena, and The Newspaper Widow. She explains how creating this mythical setting freed her up to reimagine Cebu and its inhabitants. She talks about some of the fictional characters who were inspired by the people of Cebu. Now, the lectures we bring to you serve as acts of cultural production, which also serve as a means of boosting cultural identity. Whether tangible or intangible, culture plays a key role in reinforcing identity, binding together a community, and diversifying our national identity. It is in this spirit that the Vicente Soto Lecture Series has taken shape. So on behalf of the Cebuano Study Center, I welcome you all today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that welcome, Dr. Bea. So again, before we begin, I just like to remind everyone one last time that you can fill out an evaluation form, which will be posted in the chat box towards the end of the lecture. Also, we will have an open forum at the end. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box, either for everyone or straight to Dr. Bea. And that's it. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Cecilia Manguerra Brainard. Cecilia Manguerra Brainard is the award-winning author of 10 books, including When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, The Newspaper Window, Magdalena, Vegan and Other Stories, and Out of Cebu, Essays and Personal Prose. She edited 4 books, co-edited 6 books, and co-authored a novel, Angelica's Daughters. Her work has been translated into Finnish and Turkish, and many of her stories and articles have been widely anthologized. Cecilia has received many awards, including a California Arts Council Fellowship in Fiction, a Brody Arts Fund Award, a special recognition award for her work dealing with Asian American youths, as well as a certificate of recognition from the California State Senate, 21st District, and the Outstanding Individual Award from her birth city, Cebu, Philippines. She has received several travel grants from the USIS. She has lectured and performed at UCLA, USC, University of Connecticut, University of the Philippines, Penn, Shakespeare and Company in Paris, and many others. She teaches creative writing at the Writers Program at UCLA Extension. So, wow, ladies and gentlemen, a virtual round of applause for Cecilia Manguerra Brainard.
Cecilia Manguerra Brainard here to give a talk entitled Ubec, Cebu Reimagined for the Cebuano Study Center as part of the Vicente Sotto lecture series. As a Cebuana, I am thrilled to be part of this and wish to thank Drs. Hope Sabanyu and B. Lastimosa for including me. As some of you know, I am a writer and editor of over 20 books, including 3 novels and 4 short story collections. Many of my stories use the setting Ubec, which is Cebu backwards. My mythical setting of Ubec, U-B-E-C, is a lot like Cebu, but it isn't the real Cebu. This talk is about how I created this mythical setting, which freed me to reimagine Cebu and its inhabitants in my fiction writing. I will also talk about some of my stories and fictional characters and how they were inspired by Cebu. You will find Ubec in many of my short stories and my 3 novels, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, Magdalena, and the more recent, The Newspaper Widow. I'd like to start by giving some facts about the Cebu I grew up in before I go into the reimagining part. I was born after World War II, the youngest of 4 children. My parents were Mariano Flores Manguerra and Concepcion Cuenco Manguerra. My father had been in the guerrilla movement in Mindanao, where he, my mother, and their 3 children lived during wartime. When liberation came, and because my father's house in Manila was completely destroyed, my parents decided to settle in Cebu, where my mother's family, the Cuencos, come from. We had a house, and I grew up in back of the Capitolio area, along a small road that was named to honor my father, Guerrillero Street, but the name has since been changed. The Second World War had left my mother malnourished with malaria, and I, in turn, was born in 1947 with beriberi, which almost killed me. I survived, and my mother credits her prayers to Cebu's beloved Santo Niño. She had danced her prayers to him so I would live. I went to school at St. Teresa's College in Cebu, which was ran by strict Belgian nuns. We are talking about the early 1950s when the sirens would go off at 7 in the morning, noon, and 5 in the afternoon. As a little girl, I saw evidence of the war. I remember the ruins of the Veloso Paterno mansion across St. Teresa's College, its magnificent columns hinting at the grandeur of the place. A rusted World War II seacraft sat in the sea in Liloan. I even remember snatches of stories that my parents told their friends. They had been in Malaybalay, for instance. They had a horse named Rubino. Papa would disappear for days without Mama knowing where he was, only to find out that he had gone with the Americans to Australia. There was a doctora, they said, who was killed by the Japanese. There was another person killed for owning a radio. There were so many war stories, and I did not know it, but I had tucked them away in my young brain until one day I would write about that war much later on in my life. Mama, who grew up in the Parian, liked to buy her tablea, her chocolate, and hojaldres from her suki there. She also shopped at the Carbon Market. On Sundays, we used to have picnics in Talisay where we ate lechon, puso, consilba. We swam for hours. We children swam for hours until our skin turned wrinkly. We also went clamming, mangaykay. We bought our rosquillos from Titays in Liloan, and we went to fiestas in Mactan and Karkar and various places. Whenever we were in Karkar, Mama would always talk about her mother's family, the Alesnas, who were related to the Montes Claros and Noels. I also learned about my mother's paternal side of the family, the Cuencos. The men were politicians. My grandfather, Mariano Jesus Cuenco, had been governor and senator. My uncle, Manuel Cuenco, had been governor of Cebu. My grandfather's brother, Miguel Cuenco, was representative. It ran in the family. But it was the women in my mother's family who fascinated me most. There was my mother's grandmother, Remedios Lopez Cuenco, who, widowed at the age of 39, took over running her husband's printing press, the Imprenta Rosario. Remedios was said to have been the first woman publisher in Cebu. I also heard about my mother's great-grandmother, Juana Lopez, who came from Naik, Cavite, and who was said to have loved dancing when she was young, but who had a good head for business. Her business brought her to Cebu and to Leyte. At a young age, I knew about my family in Cebu. There was no television when I was a girl, and radio, soap operas, and storytelling were popular activities. After work was done, out in the dirty kitchen, our household help would tell stories and I would listen. Stories about the supernatural, Sigbin, San Telmo, Duende, Agta. In fact, our own jackfruit tree in the backyard had an Agta, although I never saw it. And Ungo, witches too. There was a local woman who wore black and used an umbrella to cover her face when she walked around. She really made an impression on me when I was a child, as did the woman who had poofed hairdo. She had hairdo like that, and she was said to have horns. There are so many aspects of Cebu that captivated me when I was a child. The big dance on Friday or Saturday nights, the amateur hour at the Fuente Osmeña, the evening processions with carrozas during local fiestas, the fiestas with open houses, dancing in the plaza under streamers, and there were the local queens. Our evening rides after school included a stop by a small restaurant, a little kiosk near Magellan's Cross, where Papa bought us Cokes and M&Ms. And afterwards, we would drive on towards the pier with a stop at Slapsy Maxie's bar, where my parents would talk to the owners while we children stayed inside the Jeep. Slapsy Maxie's bar had colorful women with foreign sailors, and so that's why we had to stay in the Jeep, and I used to gawk at them. The return ride from our paseo always included a stop by Monay's Bakery, where we bought pan francés and pan Monay. I also remember the violent typhoons that would leave the house in darkness because there was no electricity. And the good part about those typhoons was that there was no school. The most traumatic time that happened to me was my father's sudden death when I was 9. Fortunately, my mother had a good business mind to hold the family together, but this was a scar that haunted me and my family for years. In fact, my father's death nudged me to start writing. As a young girl, I started writing him letters to update him of my life. From writing on stationery and scraps of paper, I went on to keeping a journal. Once my sister gave me a lock and key pink diary, and I never really stopped writing since I started writing in that little journal. For high school, I attended St. Teresa's in Manila, in San Marcelino, and I went to Maryknoll College for my Bachelor of Arts in Communication Arts. At that time, I wanted to be a filmmaker, which was why, after I graduated from college, my mother sent me to California to attend film school at UCLA. As things turned out, I married a former Peace Corps volunteer who had been assigned to Leyte, and we settled in Southern California, where we had 3 children, 3 sons. For many years, I was busy being a housewife and mother until the children were in school, and I discovered I had some time to myself. I filled the time by writing. I wrote essays for a bi-monthly column in a newspaper, and I started writing short stories, very clumsily at first. And so I took creative writing classes at the writers program at UCLA Extension, where I later taught for many, many years. I'd like to talk to you a bit about how Cebu ended up Ubec in my fiction, because my early stories didn't feature Ubec at all. I'll focus on some of my short stories and all 3 of my novels. One of the difficulties I had when I started writing was this notion of writer's voice. By this, I mean that my early stories lacked a distinct Filipino voice. The stories were somewhat generic, so much so that a workshop participant told me that a graduate from Sacred Heart College in New York could have written my story. It was a critique that stunned me, but which led me into deeper reflection about this idea of writer's voice and also the other various elements of fiction writing. To try and capture my own voice, a Filipino voice, I deliberately set my stories in Cebu. I turned to my memories of the place and its people, as well as its history and culture. If you were an artist, you would call this the palette. This was my palette, if you will. Even though I knew how to construct stories and had some published stories, I used to get blocked. When I wrote, I used to get blocked. Using what was real compelled me to tell the truth, which just drove me to paralysis. And one day, while doodling on a piece of paper, I reversed Cebu, C-E-B-U, into Ubec, U-B-E-C. And I stared at those letters on a piece of paper, and I fell in love with how it looked and how it sounded. And I decided then to use Ubec as my mythical setting for my stories, some of them anyway. Suddenly, I could transform the woman from my youth, the one who was said to have horns with a poofed hairdo, into the sensual widow Agustina in my short story, Woman with Horns. This particular story, which is quite popular among many students, is set in 1903 during the American period. I deliberately explored Cebu's history in my writings. Of course, this was not Ubec's history, although many times the histories of Ubec and Cebu ran parallel. The characters changed, however. I should mention that not all of my fictional characters are based on real people. Sometimes they are amalgams of characters, or sometimes the characters are purely fictional. That is, they just come to me. They appear in my imagination, sometimes fuzzy to start with, although sometimes they appear complete. Fuzzy or complete, I still have to flesh them out in order to be able to use them in my writing. In my stories, the geography of Ubec has changed, and it has stopped being the real Cebu. Some landmarks remain: the old Spanish church, the Spanish fort, the Plaza Independencia, the old part of Cebu, this colonial Cebu. As I write, I make changes to avoid getting bogged down and to move the story along. What is important are my characters. Are they fleshed out and believable? Do they have conflicts? Does the story have tension? Do my characters change? That is, do they develop as the story moves along? Some of my stories are inspired by real people and events. For instance, this is kind of a favorite story. The blue-green chiffon dress is about a teenager named Gemma who has an encounter with an American soldier from Mactan. Now, this sprung from that time of my life when the Vietnam War was raging and there was an American air base in Mactan. Some of you will remember the young American soldiers on R&R from Vietnam who roamed the streets of Cebu, who were welcomed somewhat tentatively by Cebu society. Another story inspired by real people is The Virgin's Last Night. Some Cebuanos will still remember the two old maids who lived on Mango Avenue. They were my mother's sisters, Lourdes and Carmen Cuenco. My tia Oding, Lourdes, didn't get married so she could take care of her younger sister, Carmen, who had health issues. They lived together and they hosted family celebrations, and they were very generous to us, their nephews and nieces. They gifted me and my cousins money on Christmas. Tia Oding gave me family pictures when she found out I was interested in family genealogy. They were the ones who took care of the family mausoleum. If you remember those old-fashioned mausoleums, ours looked like a three-tiered wedding cake in my eyes. These aunts were part of my childhood. When Carmen passed away, Maming, Lourdes followed not too long after. And I felt really sad. I felt great loss. And perhaps because of my sadness, this particular story, The Virgin's Last Night, started shaping up in my head. The germ of the story was that when Lourdes was young, she had an ardent suitor whom she rejected. But this suitor still came back when they were older, and still Lourdes rejected him. Perhaps as a way to give them life, my old maid aunts whom I loved, the story, The Virgin's Last Night, came about. It is about an old unmarried woman whose old suitor, Mateo, long dead, visits her as a ghost on the night when she dies. I also wrote a short story inspired by my father's sudden death. It's entitled Waiting for Papa's Return. This story about Remedios parallels my own story when I was 9 and learned from our mother superior at school that my father had died of a heart attack in Hong Kong. In my story, because of the trauma the girl goes through, she suspends reality and continues to believe that her father will return so that they can sip tea under the cool shade of the lush star apple trees. So perhaps this was something too where I had suspended reality, and this is why I continued to write letters to my father, which started me on this writing career. I'm going to end part 1 here, and we will continue. This is part 2 of my talk. I'd like to talk now about my novels because these were challenging to write, and they reflect, in my opinion, many aspects of Cebu's culture and history, albeit reimagined. My first novel was first known as Song of Yvonne, then later as When the Rainbow Goddess Wept. I wrote it after I finished my first short story collection, Woman with Horns and Other Stories. I wanted to challenge myself. I knew how to write short stories, but I wanted to see if I could write a novel. So I began my first novel. Following the writing rule to write about what you know, that is something that they always say, write about what you know. I wrote about the time of my life when I was young, maybe 8 years old, when my father was still alive. I was trying to capture happy moments of my childhood. For instance, the visits my mother and I used to make to the house of her best friend, Mercedes Rodriguez. While my mother and Mommy Ding Ding, as I called her, chatted, I played with her niece Esperanza, and we used to mess around the nearby Barba Press, and sometimes we watched movies for free at that Avenue Theater. When I had around 200 typewritten pages, the draft of my novel, I declared I finished. I have a novel. I even had the nerve to send a manuscript to literary agents, all of whom rejected the work. Discouraged and depressed, I set aside my work. But one day, my husband and I saw the movie Hope and Glory about a boy during World War II in London. And I had an epiphany. That movie had a connection with what I was trying to write. I looked at my draft and realized several things. A, my work had no conflict, no tension whatsoever. My work was boring. My draft was boring. Nothing happened. B, nothing happened to the characters in my draft. The characters meandered from one place to another and remained the same. They did not undergo character change or development, which is essential in stories. When I read my draft carefully, I discovered the characters talking about their past during World War II. Do you remember when they would say so-and-so was killed? Do you remember the doctora who was hacked to death? And so on. They were talking about what was important to them. The pleasant merienda sessions that I wrote about did not make up their real stories. I thought about all these and realized that the work, my draft, was demanding to be a World War II story. It wanted to be a coming of age story, just like the movie Hope and Glory. I remember being frightened because of the writing rule, write of what you know. Since I was born after the war, I felt I didn't know this war, but at the same time, it was becoming crystal clear that this was what the story wanted to be. So after I had accepted the idea that my work wanted to be about the war, I metaphorically rolled up my sleeves and started rewriting the draft. If it was going to be a war story, then it would start when the war began. And so now the reimagining of Cebu took place. My real mother and father and the child that I was were moved back in time from the 1950s to 1941. I had to flesh them out because now they had become different. The young girl stopped being me, and I named her Yvonne. Her father was a man like my father, a former university professor of engineering who joined the guerrilla movement in Mindanao. I named him Nando Macaraig. And the girl's mother was like my mother, a beautiful, somewhat high-strung woman. I named her Angeline. Yvonne had a first cousin named Esperanza, daughter of Angeline's sister. Esperanza had traits like my real-life friend Esperanza, who was somewhat naughty but was a lot of fun. They all lived in a big house like the Bahay na Bato houses in Parian. And they had a cook named Laidan, modeled after our real-life cook Mengay, except my fictional Laidan was a former epic singer. Thus, I worked on a novel following these characters as they responded to the external pressures of the war. I added characters or modified existing characters as I felt needed. I mostly followed my instinct, and I had to use my imagination because I had not experienced that war. I had not actually traveled by boat to Mindanao during wartime. I had not really felt the intimidation of Japanese soldiers. I had not actually witnessed war deaths. I used many of the stories I had heard from my parents about real events that they had experienced during wartime, from the horse they had owned named Rubino to the doctora who was hacked to death, to my mother's actual loss of a baby boy during that war. By the time I embraced the idea that the novel wanted to be a war story, the pages started to flow. That was how this coming of age story of a young girl during World War II came about. The book was first published as Song of Yvonne by New Day. It was picked up by Dutton Penguin, then the University of Michigan Press, and the title was changed to When the Rainbow Goddess Wept. It was also translated into Turkish. The Philippine rights, when the Philippine rights reverted back to me, it was published once again in the Philippines by the University of Santo Tomas Press, the University of Santo Tomas Publishing House. Both editions remain in print, the US and the Philippine editions. After my first novel was published, I felt a bit cocky thinking I knew how to write a novel, and I set about writing my second one. In its final form, the second novel is the story of 3 generations of women whose lives have been affected by various wars in the Philippines. My draft started with the story of one woman, Magdalena, a married woman whose husband has a querida. While Magdalena is dealing with this husband, she meets and falls in love with an American soldier from Mactan. And here I drew from the period of around 1967 when the Americans had a base in Mactan. But then I found myself writing about Magdalena's mother, whose life was affected by World War II, and then her grandmother, whose life was affected by the Philippine-American War. The first draft was quite messy, sprawling, confusing, and boring. Regardless, I sent this to agents only to be rejected, and then eventually I accepted. I didn't have a novel. Since I had put all that work into it, I decided to try and salvage what I could from all my pages. That is, I worked to turn chapters or excerpts into short stories when I could. So I started to do that. I would take one chapter and cut off unnecessary parts, clean it up, hone it so it read like a short story. Then I would get into another chapter, do the same. And after a while, I had a realization that these pieces, these short stories, were really telling a bigger story, which was the novel. I understood that this work wanted that particular form. The form was fragmented and nonlinear, but that was what it wanted to be. So the end product of my second novel, Magdalena, is a fragmented piece about the lives of 3 women affected by the various wars in the Philippines, including the Philippine-American War, World War II, and the Vietnam War. This second novel taught me something important, and that is that no one really learns how to write a novel. The character-driven ones, at least. That's why we call it a novel. Every novel has its own demands, and the writer has to go along with those demands rather than to impose what he or she thinks the novel wants to be. So this novel is also available in the Philippines and in the US. It was first published in the United States, and then it was picked up by the University of Santo Tomas Publishing House, and there's a second American edition out. After the second novel, I wanted to see if I could write a murder mystery. I wanted to write something fun and maybe easier. So there's a nonprofit site online called the NaNoWriMo, short for the National Novel Writing Month. And this hosts a writing event in November. You sign up online, and per the informal agreement, you try to write 1,700 words every day of the month of November. If you meet this self-imposed deadline, you will have around 50,000 words, which is the length of a short novel. It's not easy writing 1,700 words of your novel daily, but what happens is that you stop thinking and you just work like crazy at achieving that number count. To be honest, even though some participants believe they have completed novels by the end of November, you end up with mishmash, not a novel. But what does happen is that in the mad race of getting the words out of you, you kick out some good ideas, stuff with potential. Those are the parts to explore and develop. So for this novel, I had a notion that I would start with a dead body since it's a murder mystery after all. And as sometimes happens with me, images or scenes will pop up in my head that suggest to me the direction of my work. Sometimes voices even talk in my head too, which may seem weird to others, but which I have learned indicates to me that my work is more or less writing itself. And while the draft of my NaNoWriMo was all over the place, the parts of the novel were surfacing. I knew the setting was during the American period, 1909, in Ubec, with a woman detective as the protagonist. When creating, my mind is not operating in a logical way all the time. It's like juggling logic and instinct, and these images or nudgings just come to me. For whatever reason, I decided to make my great-grandmother, Remedios Lopez Cuenco, the model for my detective. Remedios, as I mentioned to you, was the matriarch of the Cuenco family. She married Mariano Albao Cuenco when she was only 13 years old, 13. She bore 16 children, although only 5 survived past infancy. Her oldest son, Jose Maria Cuenco, became Archbishop of Haro. Her second son, Mariano Jesus Cuenco, became Cebu's governor, then senator, then Senate president at the height of his political career. Her third son, Miguel Cuenco, became a congresswoman. A daughter, Dolores, was known as a storyteller. Another son, Jaime, died in his teens. Remedios was widowed at the age of 39. Daughter of a woman who had a good head for business, this is Juana Lopez we're talking about, Remedios invested in real estate and she built homes to rent out. The rentals kept her and her children afloat. But she did something else. Her husband, Mariano Albao, who had been a writer and publisher, had owned the Imprenta Rosario, a press that occupied the first floor of their house in Colon Street, Parian. With her husband gone, this 39-year-old woman with a bunch of children decided to keep the press going. She ran it with the help of her 3 sons who had various newspapers and publications. So my third novel, The Newspaper Widow, is set in Ubec in 1909 during the American period, the time when America was testing the waters of being a colonial power. My character in The Newspaper Widow, Ines Maceda, is a widow in her late 30s who inherits her husband's failing newspaper business. In the novel, I followed this widow who's trying to make ends meet and make the newspaper business successful. She has 1 son, not many children, as Remedios actually had. And Ines's only son ends up in jail as a suspect of the priest's murder. Ines, with the help of her friend, a French dressmaker, couturier, solved the crime in order to free Ines's son. Well, the fictional character Ines Maceda was modeled after my great-grandmother Remedios. By the time I fleshed her out for the novel, she ceased being Remedios. She was no longer Remedios. But maybe, even though I had never met my great-grandmother, maybe I captured her tenacity and determination and humanity. I had to do research to be able to imagine Ubec, wherein my characters moved around. The real Cebu seemed lovely during this American period because the Americans pumped a lot of money into the Philippines. Cebu's train, for instance, while I had seen postcards of Cebu's train station, I was fascinated to do research and learn details about the Philippine Railway Company in Cebu. For example, here's research information about Cebu's trains from the 1909 report of the Philippine Commission to the Secretary of War. In the island of Cebu, quote, practically all the railway has been completed except that across the island from Karkar to Barili and south to Mualbual, which is under investigation and survey, and 60 miles are in operation. The line now connects the northern and southern terminal points of Danao and Argao. There are 22 stations on this line, 22, 20 of which are constructed and reinforced concrete. 4 mixed trains are run daily each way, giving an excellent passenger and fast freight service. I also discovered that the train cars were exactly like the train cars in San Francisco. Teak wood for first class and parlor coaches, yellow pine for second class. I did not necessarily include all the research information I found, but they helped me make the scenes for my novel clearer in my mind. And since my character's world is Ubec, not Cebu, I can change things as needed for my novel. As it turned out, the newspaper widow ended up a literary mystery rather than a regular murder mystery. It has been praised in the Manila Times as definitely crime fiction that's a cut above the usual whodunits, and the Library Journal in the US also said the mystery elements are competently plotted and the characters appealing, and there's a charming long distance romance with a hint of another yet to come. The book's signal virtue, though, is its big-hearted look at Filipino culture and history and society in 1909. I love very much that the Library Journal had recognized that big-hearted look at Filipino culture and history and society in 1909. It seems paradoxical, but in reimagining Cebu, the real Cebu, into my mythical Ubec, I am able to inform readers about Cebuano history, culture, and society. I also find it gratifying that in my writing, my third novel, in reimagining my great-grandmother Remedios, whom I never met, whom I never knew, I got to know her better as a woman who struggled to keep her family together and to make a success of her husband's imprenta Rosario. And with that, I will end part 2 of my talk. Thank you for your time. We're going to have a quick look at some slides, and then we will have an open forum. Thanks once again to Doctors Hope and Doctors B, and to all of you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Miss Cecilia. That was really wonderful. And as she mentioned, we're going to be showing a quick slideshow. So let's take a look at this.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I just gathered just a very few slides that relate to the talk. So here we have the ruins of the Paterno mansion, Veloso Paterno mansion on Mango Avenue that I used to see when I was a little girl for the longest time. It's right across St. Teresa's College. And then next slide. So this is not a particularly glamorous picture of us kids. That's my brother, my sister, and myself. But there is this World War II Seacraft in the back, and that is Liloan. So I'm showing this to you because this World War II was still hanging around even in the 1950s when I was a child. So it's kind of interesting. So we'll look at the next slide. That's probably the best it can do, but right about center, slightly to the left, there are some clouds, and there is actually a rainbow in there, and it says Ubec in the middle. And so that's a graffiti in Cebu. And I saw that and I was very, very amused. I was on the way to the airport. So somehow the word Ubec has filtered out and seems to suggest an idyllic place. It's kind of fun. So next slide. Just wanted to show you some covers of my first novel. Started out as Song of Yvonne, and then it was picked up by Dutton Penguin. That's the one on the bottom left. And then there was a Turkish edition, that's the left up on the corner. And then the University of Michigan Press is the one that uses the cover of my Cuenco family. And then the University of Santo Tomas uses the picture of my mother down at the bottom right with the flames. So that's the first novel. And then next slide. So these are just the short story collections. I referred to some of my short stories, and most of them mentioned Ubec. So the first one was Woman with Horns down in the corner left. The next one was Acapulco at Sunset, and then you had Vegan and other stories. And then the selected short stories pull together what I think are the best from all those and more, 39 stories. So next slide. And so this is my second novel, and we have the first US edition, Magdalena, up on top with the image of the three women. And then on the right bottom is the Philippine edition by the University of Santo Tomas. And then the second US edition is the one down below. I'm showing that real photo on the left because this was a photo from when I was in the 1960s, when Mactan was, the Americans were in Mactan, and you will see three Americans there in the back. And so, you know, this was kind of the world I was in when I was a teenager. And so they made their way into some of my stories, that particular time era in Cebu. Next slide. And so this is my third novel. And so that's on the left is the Santo Tomas edition. On the right is the American edition. And that is, the woman up there is my model for my detective. And that is Remedios Lopez Cuenco, the formidable woman who at 39 had 16 children, who got married at 13 and, you know, raised a archbishop, a senator, and so on. And I don't believe there's any other slide, is there? No? So I guess we go on to open forum.
All right, so thank you so much for the additional slides. I really appreciate them. I don't think I'm the only one. We also have a comment here in the chat box that says that this is Carmen Rodriguez saying that she remembers seeing those arches when she attended STC as a child. So I'm sure it helped bring back some good memories. And yes, and I believe I've also seen that graffiti of Ubec. I remember looking at it and I picked it up because I remember reading that from your book. So I thought, oh, how wonderful. Maybe a reader was the one who did that. So thank you for the additional slides, Dr. Cecilia. That was really a wonderful lecture.
I'm not PhD, just Cecilia.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Just a writer.
I'd like to thank you for that. I personally enjoyed it. I really was all ears because, again, I did read your books before, and then just hearing the process that goes on behind it, it's wonderful to know that it was a journey. It was something that you really had to work through, and it was just really wonderful to hear that. So thank you for all your work, and we actually have some questions for our open forum, and Ms. Cecilia is so kind to say that she'd give us some of her time and answer these questions. So I'm going to read out the first one. Okay, it's actually a series of questions. I'm going to read them all out first, and then maybe we can break down. I'm not sure. It's up to Ms. Cecilia. So this is from Susan Evangelista. She says, I'm always fascinated when writers create worlds. Do you think Ubec has become more real to you than childhood memories? Has the line between the two faded? Do old friends ever comment on what you have done with their pasts? That's an interesting one. Okay, so those were the questions from Susan Evangelista, who I believe is here in the Zoom room.
Yes. Hi, Susan. Susan is a professor at the Ateneo and then at Palawan, and we are co-writers. Thank you for attending, Susan.
You're welcome. It.
So to answer your question, do Cebu and Ubec blur? I think I can still separate them. But I will tell you what happens. I think I can separate the, if it's places or something like that. Although, of course, when I'm doing research, then this more idyllic colonial Cebu becomes more real in my head. But, I know, I still know what is real. Where it starts to blur is when I am working with people. And especially if if my character is quite close to the model, because then I'm looking at the real person, but I've already plugged in a whole other life in them. And so I have to sort of like check myself and say, no, this is not the story I wrote. Do people ever ask me if, what did I do to them in stories? Now, so this is really interesting because I have had some writer friends who say that their mother got angry at them because they wrote about their mother or something like that. But another writer told me that the capacity for a person to deny is great. And so when something real is written and they don't like to believe it, they will not believe it. And so nobody's really come up to me and said, hey, why did you write about me in that way? And frankly, Susan, you know that by the time we get done with the work, it's really quite changed, and if anybody did come up to me, I think I could feel absolutely confident in saying, I did not write about you. You are not that character. But thank you. I have to mention that I think it was either Ben Santos, the writer, or NBM Gonzalez, I think it was Ben, who once told me something along these lines, that sometimes they would blur the fictional characters and the real character, reality and the imaginative setting and so on would blur. So just as another writer's point of view. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Miss Cecilia. That was a wonderful answer, and they were also a wonderful set of questions. And I'd just like to comment that I think for you, it's interesting that this mythical Cebu of yours, this mythical city, can become more real for a feeling for what Cebu was like in the past. So that's very interesting. So we have actually several questions here. So here is a quick one. It is, who is your target reader?
Okay, who's my target reader? I suppose it is somebody who appreciates fiction, who appreciates a good story. And as to whether it's specific, as to what country, I don't think it really matters, because my work has been translated in Finnish or in Turkish, and obviously those people got the stories and hopefully appreciated them. So it's just somebody who wants to read a good story, and I'm hoping that my stories are good enough.
All right, thank you, Miss Cecilia. We have one more.
Yes? May I add something?
Sure.
I have to add that actually when I am writing, I do not really think too much of the target audience. In other words, I'm not saying I'm going to write this for women who are 35 years old and who are, you know, to me, that's not how it works. It is the struggle is with the story, and to create it and to let it come out. And so probably it's just doing that, putting it out there, and hopefully finding the target audience.
You're right. I remember in your what you were saying it's like even the story writes itself. So it's not particularly about the target reader, but the story coming alive.
For me. And then hopefully it finds the readers. It will appeal to the right people.
Yes, thank you. All right, so we have a question from Michael Agnoberana.
Hello, Michael.
Yes. Did you have personal audience with Bienvenido Lumbera and F. Chanel Jose, who recently passed away? Is there any way your writings have influenced them or the other way around?
I do not know Mr. Lumbera well, although I have met him, but I can say that I knew Ben and I were friends, and I don't mean to be fresh by calling him Ben, but that was what we called him because I met him in the States back in 1985, and we used to communicate, and he used to sort of mentor me the same way Lina Espina Moore did. I am not sure Ben needed my influence on his writing because he was in his 70s when I met him. And so he had his own voice and he knew what he was doing. As to whether he influenced me, Ben is one of those writers who, like Linda T. Casper, whom I admire greatly as a writer, follow character and character development. And so, for instance, his Scent of Apples, I've read that like several times, you know, to find out what it is that I like. So I would have to say that, yes, Ben has influenced me because of how he follows character development. Ditto with Linda T. Casper. I have also studied her stories very carefully, as I did Lina Espina Moore. Lina Espina Moore taught me more the notion of the Cebuano voice, our own voice, and how to just relax and just, you know, do it.
Oh, that's wonderful. When you mentioned that you would communicate with Bienvenido Lumbera, the reader historian in me goes, oh yes, Santos, the reader historian in me goes, I wish we could read that that exchange. That would be so interesting. So thank you for that. Thank you, Miss Cecilia, and thank you, Michael, for the question. It seems like we have several writers here watching this, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think that's what I was thinking when you were sharing your story. It's so nice to hear the journey of the writer, because there are so many aspiring writers who really do need advice and maybe a little bit of just some guidance.
Good.
Okay, so this is from Renee Lim. What can you recommend for aspiring novel writers that have a full-time job? Do we need to write at least 1,700 words per day, or just whenever we want to write?
Okay, my first advice to people who want to write, number one, before the writing, is to read and read and read and read and read. And you want to read the kind of work that you want to produce. If you want to be a poet, you read the best poetry. If you want to be a novelist, you read the best novels. Okay, so if you have done that homework, in other words, the question is, how do you budget your time? I will tell you that I need deadlines. I have so many things going on in my life. I have a family, I have gardening, I have knitting, I do art. You see in back of there, I have my fake Caravaggio that I did. So I put myself in a workshop. And then when somebody tells me, you submit so many pages next week, I will do it. And so that is what that NaNoWriMo did to me. It just gave me a push to do that. So to the person asking and to whoever else has that same concern, no, we are all different. But if it could help you to be in a kind of a workshop situation where you feel safe, and where you're given a deadline, before you get there, you ought to get basic classes about how to write. You need to know the basics of storytelling. So I have met very many writers who don't know how to do dialogue, who don't know what plot is all about. So you need to know that. You need to take just a basic class or several classes, a workshop maybe, where you're learning these things. And then you have to, for myself, you want a structure. I know it's hard if you're working full time, but maybe even like in the summer, or maybe some Saturday class. I'm not sure. You have to find a way where you can have a time and space for your writing. It also helps if you have your own little space at home where you will not be bothered and where you can kind of write, you know. So some people do that at coffee shops. They will actually go and then just kind of work. So you have to find your way, but it's not easy, and you have to just, but you need the skill, you need the basic information first, and you have to read and read and read, and you need to take some basic classes before you write 200 pages and say, I have a novel. I hope that answered. The other thing is, if I don't answer your questions thoroughly, I am very easy to find in social media, and you just nudge me. So you just tell me, you didn't answer my question, all of it, you know, and then ask me.
Here by Dr. Jed Acero.
Hello, Dr. Jed.
Thank you po for your words. It inspires me po. How nice.
Thank
All right,
you.
so we have again this one by Dr. Jed Acero. Is it okay to write narrative story without conflict, but I put a non-fiction part of the story?
Okay, so that is an interesting question. You know, writing is an art, and you can always break the rules. But the rule is that it really should have conflict. So, and that's an important part of storytelling. You might get into something experimental if you're doing something like that, and I can see how that could be interesting, you know, where you're popping in nonfiction. But it's one of the real basics of storytelling. You need character, and you need the character must have conflict, and the character has to deal with that conflict. And so that's kind of like a little basic thing there in terms of what plot is. Plot is character in conflict in action. And so you need a character. Sometimes people will say, well, do I need a character? You need a character or several characters, and you need something to happen to that character. And if you don't have conflict, as you know, as my first draft of that Rainbow Goddess was, it meanders and it is boring. Nothing happens. People cannot tolerate reading 200 pages if nothing is happening. So I don't know, Dr. Jed, if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you, Dr. Cecilia. And just as a side announcement to the viewers, the evaluation form is already in the chat box, so you can click on that for you to get your certificate of participation. Okay, so this is more of like a casual, personal question, Ms. Cecilia. Of all the books you have written, which is your favorite?
Okay, that's like asking you who's your favorite child. You have 3 children, and you have to ask, who's your favorite child? It's really hard. I have a special affection for the first one, the World War II one, because in a way it tells my parents' stories, you know, about the war. so there's a feeling for that one. The feelings are different, but there is a love for all of them, because each one took quite a lot from me, a lot of effort, a lot of thinking, a lot of creation. So it's a very difficult question to answer. So the best way I can answer is I have maybe slightly different feelings for each one of them, but I love them all. The same way with your children. Think of your children. You love them all. You may find somebody pilio. You may find somebody more willing to work with you, but you love them anyway. Sorry, can't be more.
Thank you. Okay, we have another one from Charles Sanchez. Hello, Ma'am Cecilia. Thank you for the lecture. You mentioned earlier that you previously taught Okay. Sorry, I think I'm not sure if sometimes my audio cuts out.
It flipped out, but I'm catching it on chat.
All right. So it says here, teaching is, I think, the usual occupation of writers or literary people. Do you find yourself having more time now that you're no longer in academia, considering teaching is a job where you take a lot of work home? What advice would you have for writers who are also full-time teachers?
Okay, thank you, Charles. First of all, I'm not an academic. I was invited by the writers program to teach 1 or 2 classes. So it was not like I was a full-time professor or anything like that. And so the teaching never really sucked all my time, although I do understand what you mean about a lot of papers to read and to critique and all of this. So having said that, I don't feel like I have, since I was just teaching 1 or 2 classes, it was just part-time. I don't feel that now suddenly my schedule has changed a lot. I will tell you that with this pandemic, I've had a lot of time at home. I don't know about all of you. So a lot of kind of creativity happening. I've been taking art, I've been gardening, knitting, everything. So now what to do if you are in the academe and the writers? I have many writer friends who manage. They are, I know them, most of them, they're teachers at UP and so on. And they managed to write. They've managed to have the time to write. My guess is that probably some of them belong to workshops. And so they probably get together and they have opportunities to have deadlines to share their work and to discuss it. That is my guess. It takes a lot of time to do it. I mean, it's really true. So I have great admiration to those who are working full-time and are still able to produce. But there are some obsessive people. I mean, they're working full-time and then they go home and they're writing until 1 o'clock or whatever in the morning. So it depends. There is something that sometimes when there's something in my head that needs to come out, I will be a little bit crazy like that, where it's like I'm just like, leave me alone, I have to do this, and then I'm working on it. But mostly I'm lazy, or I need that structure. There's so many things to do, I mean, there is still life out there. You can't just be with your computer. So yeah, it's you have to juggle your time. It's difficult. I'm sorry, Charles, I don't have a pat answer.
All right. So a person of many interests, it helps to have some kind of a structure, because you want to put a time for all your many interests. Thank you, Dr. Cecilia. Actually, Dr. Marge Alvina Acosta says, hello. Thank you, Ms. Cecilia, because she was going to ask the same question. So we have full-time teachers, aspiring writers here. And also Dr. Jed Piacero, who asked the question earlier, says, thanks so much, Dr. Cecilia. You make my day. Hope to meet you and see you personally before my departure. Charot. Okay. So, all right. So, and even Charles Sanchez says here, thank you so much, Dr. Cecilia. Okay, there's a follow-up question from Dr. Marge Alvina Acosta. Is it right to call your work historical fiction, even if they are based on real-life characters?
Okay, hi, Dr. Marge, Maryknoll College. You know, they have never really, the publishers have never really straight out called my work historical fiction. They have not tagged it as historical fiction. And I think there's a reason for that. I think when you are probably calling something historical fiction, it's probably more tied in to history, as in you're writing about, you know, a historical character who's in a particular historical time frame. So even though my story was about World War II or about the early American period, the characters are fictional, and nobody's really said that. They will refer to it sometimes, part detective, part historical fiction, but they don't categorize it that way. They'll categorize it as literary fiction. I'm trying to think of what other categories they use, but and even if they are based on real life characters, and I have to correct that, because they are not really based on real life characters. The characters may have inspired me, but for instance, the widow in my novel is no longer Remedios Lopez Cuenco. My widow has only one son. Remedios had 16 children and 5 survivors. So they're different now. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, so thank you so much for that. We have a question here by Rachel Scheffler. What would you consider interesting to read in a memoir?
Oh, in a memoir, gee whiz, you know, I'm into World War II again. I will go through phases, and I'm reading about memoir. So, I mean, I'm actually reading Holocaust memoirs, but, you know, so this is not exactly Cebuano or Filipino, just because I'm interested right now in that World War II period. So I'm trying to think if we have any really good memoirs in Filipino lit. And I'm sure we do. I don't know, the professors out there probably can spit it out just right there. Anyone want to throw that in? Okay, well, we're waiting for an answer. I'm going to answer Charles's question. He goes, not sure if you mentioned this earlier, Mom Cecilia, but are there any places, bookstores here in Cebu that carry your titles? If yes, where? I don't know about the bookstores, but fortunately, the University of Santo Tomas Publishing House does have Shopee and Lazada. So they have all the books available there aside from their bookstore. So I believe that is easy to find, Shopee and Lazada. So I don't know if anybody has come up with a good memoir, or you come back to me, email me, and I will get some good memoirs for you to look at.
Okay, thank you. And Charles says thank you, and he will check it out. So thank you for those questions. And we have another one here. Okay, so this is asking, it's more about your experience in straddling 2 cultures. What are the challenges of being a writer in the diaspora straddling two cultures?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's something that has been, an issue, so to speak. It has not been easy to kind of be in two worlds in one sense. So I have been fortunate because aside from the pandemic, I have been able to visit the Philippines twice a year, not during the pandemic. But so I feel I'm in touch when I am doing that. I visit Cebu, I visit Manila, I see my old friends, I see how things have changed. So twice a year. And so I can still feel the pulse of what life is there. But there's also another whole life here in the States. And you kind of have to deal with both. And it's not always easy, because actually in the Philippines, it's like I don't really, I'm a little bit different to them now. And in the States, well, I'm also a little bit different to them. However, the wonderful thing about belonging to two worlds is that you develop a kind of objectivity. I can go to the Philippines, or I can see my Filipino friends, and I can see them with an objective eye. I can see things that the Filipino will not see. And likewise here, I can look at America and I can see it from another point of view. And so those are that I appreciate. And I think that has been very helpful in the writing also, because I am not just, I have a broader point of view in terms of looking at the world, in terms of looking at life, in terms of looking at people and characters. So that has been very helpful. But it has not always been easy. And I'm not going to mention names, but many times I'm cut out of this and that award. Hindi yan Tagala, hindi yan Pilipina, Americana yan. So, and I don't care, it's okay. But I do know that there are little things like that. But life.
Yes, that's true. So thank you, Miss Cecilia. I can relate to that, but on a much smaller level. That idea of perspective when you're exposed to a different place or different people, because I had a visitor once who came here from the States, and when we were driving along the road, she was asking all these questions about what does he do, what is he doing right now, like people she sees on the roads. And I look around and I'm thinking, wow, it's like I never even noticed these things. So it suddenly gave me this like outsider's perspective on what the Philippines must look like. And it really got me thinking about things that I take for granted as just normal for everyone. But that's because I grew up in the Philippine setting. So I was just thinking about that while you were sharing. Oh, and we have a what do you call this? Like a follow-up from Susan Evangelista. Jing Hidalgo writes lovely memoirs and used to teach narrative nonfiction in UP. You can read some of Jing Hidalgo's excerpts from her old journal on FB. I enjoyed reading them all. Yes. Oh, thank you for that recommendation. All right, thank you, Susan Evangelista. And I think we're probably gonna, we still have actually more questions, but we'll probably just take two more for the sake of time. So here's another question. So for now, the next question is, what was one of the most surprising things you learned in creating your books?
One of the more surprising things in terms of creating the book. Okay, so there are many levels here. It would be surprising in terms of my discovery of myself, or for every creation there is discovery. Actually, there is a learning involved, And so it is a learning on my end, and it may not just be about the skills of writing, but it may also be a kind of a learning, a realization of the characters that I'm writing about. So there is that, or the people I'm writing about. So as I mentioned, for instance, when I went into the second novel, I was so confident that I knew how to write a novel because I had done a first one. And so that was a big surprise to me, that each novel is different and each novel requires something different from you, at least for literary titles, character-driven stories. So that was a big eye-opener there. But it is always like that. There's always something that you learn. When I did the third novel, the murder mystery, I thought I would make it more formula, you know, a dead body, the detective tries to find the person who did it, who done it. And then I found out it was boring to do that. And I had to do it my way, which was following character. And it was more exciting for me to make the story just grow and present itself. So I'm not sure that really answered the question. But so anyway, to those, like, as I mentioned, really, if you have other questions or if I was not clear, contact me. Use PALH@AOL.com and I will answer you. Okay.
Are these all small letters, Miss Cecilia?
Yeah, I believe it's none. It doesn't matter. But P
Oh,
as
I
in
see.
Paul, ALH. Paul and Larry Henry. Paul
PALH.
and Larry Henry at AOL.com.
All right. Okay. So I will put that in the chat box. So
Yes.
it's just in time, because somebody was just asking here, how can we access maybe an email or your FB page? Do you have an FB page, Miss Cecilia?
What
that
page?
We can, like a Facebook page or something?
Oh, yes. I am very active on Facebook. So you just find me, Cecilia Brainard. I'm not as active in Instagram, but I'm there too, and not as active in Twitter. I have a blog at Blogspot, travels and more. And I have a regular website, ceciliabrainard.com. So I'm very accessible, actually.
Oh, so, thank you. We'll definitely look that up.
There it is. So my email is there. You can reach me. Don't ask me to read a whole novel though.
Like comments on my novel, please. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Miss Cecilia. Also, Dr. Bea says she recommends Susan Evangelista's own book of memoirs called Growing into Asia from UP Press. Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Bea. So we have another question by Michael Agno Berania. I always think and tell my literature classes that a fictionist finds it hard to write poems and poets have a hard time doing fiction. What's your take, Miss Cecilia?
I think that there are different muses. I think there is a muse for poets, and there is a muse for short story writers, and there's a muse for novel, because they require different energies. And sometimes a poet cannot write a novel, and a novelist cannot write poems. And so, and sometimes a person can do all. But I don't write poetry. But having said that, now and then I have done that, but I don't call myself a poet, and I don't sit down and write poems. But I probably have like 10 that I've done, just whatever, you know. But yeah, it's a different kind of mindset, a different kind of energy, a different kind of push that makes one do a novel or a short story or poem. For a novel, for instance, I mean, it's like a long distance race, you know. It takes a long time because you have to do all the pages. And a poet may sit down and may be able to do it in one sitting. I don't know. It's possible, you know, but there's no way a novelist can sit down and do a novel in one night. You know what I mean? It requires a different kind of thing from you.
Thank you, Miss Cecilia. We have time for one more question. This will be our last question. And again, it's a question from an aspiring writer. What is your advice for writers who get rejected? And how should they respond to comments, criticisms, and reviews?
Okay. The one thing every writer needs to realize is that rejection is part of the game. Totally. That's just how it is. It's very rare when you submit something and then it gets accepted. And sometimes it is rejected, not because it is bad work, but because they already had the pages already full, or, you know, they've already covered the topic. So they don't want another same poem or story or something like that. So that's the one thing. I mean, I cannot imagine of a writer who has never had rejections. You just get used to it. You send it in and you get rejected. Well, I send it in, and if I get rejected, you know, whatever, I'll send it out again. It's only when it keeps consistently being rejected that I really look at it and I go, what is your problem? Why are you being rejected? You know, about maybe 4 times. But having said that, I've already usually workshopped my work or have already gotten feedback. And so I already have a confidence of the level quality of that work by the time I'm sending it out. In terms of critiques from workshops, so, you know, I especially if you're a beginning writing, it really is good to be with a workshop leader who can set the right tone, a right supportive tone, especially if you're a beginner, because it can be very devastating. Critiques can really hurt people a lot. And so you find the right environment for you where you can be safe. And then once you feel safe and confident that the people around you are on your side, they're trying to help you, they're trying to get you to improve the work and not to just, you know, destroy you, then you can with confidence listen carefully to what they have to say in terms of improving your work. And likewise, hopefully the ones critiquing, with the guidance of the teacher or workshop leader, will have taught their students, workshoppers, to choose their words carefully. Usually in critiquing, you start with the positives. You put out the strengths of the work. What is good about this work? And then you mention the weaknesses. So you don't say, this is bad dialogue. Ano ba yan? That's not the way to do it. So what you do is, you know, I really like the mother in this story, and, you know, she comes across very believable, but, you know, there's something here in the line that makes me question, why did she say this? You know, and then that calls attention to maybe there was something not quite right with that line. But, you know, people have different techniques, so I'm not saying that's the way to do it. But that overall, the workshop leader has an obligation to create a supportive environment. And likewise, the workshoppers learn to be tough enough to take it and to listen very carefully and to realize that this is not an attack on you. It is an attempt to tell you to fix your work or an attempt to communicate to you what works and what doesn't work. Having said that, the more advanced workshops will not baby you as much. By that time, you will be stronger and more confident about your writing, and you can take it later on. So, so that's all I have to say. You just have to, here's the thing. If you do not get feedback, your work will not improve. And so at a certain point, if you are really dedicated to your work, you want to know the truth so that you can make it the best that you can. I have felt that. So I hope that answers the question. And I just want to thank really Dr. Hope, I've been saying it's Bea. Thank you, and to everyone else. Thank you very much, and for your time early in the morning, Saturday. You could be doing something else, but here you are. I appreciate it. And to those outside, the one in the East Coast, thank you. It's late at night. And I hope that this has been informative. And I'll see you in cyberspace or for real, in real one day.
Thank you, Dr. Cecilia.
Thank you very much for everything.
And I think the viewers being here is a testament to your writing and how it has contributed to the Cebuano literature that we have. Thank you very much. And we actually still have questions, but we can't air them all, unfortunately. So if you have other questions you may want to ask, you may feel free to message the Cebuano Studies Center page on Facebook so we can forward them to the speaker, or Ms. Cecilia has very kindly given us also her email address so you could communicate with her if you wish. And as she said earlier, she's very active online on Facebook and with her blog. So thank you so much, Ms. Cecilia. We would like to show you before the end our deepest appreciation to our esteemed lecturer.
Yay!
So we will present our certificate of appreciation, which will be read by, again, the Deputy Director of the Cebuano Studies Center, Dr. Bea Lastimosa.
Hello, Ma'am Cecilia. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You have really inspired me, and I'm sure you have inspired a generation of Filipino writers and aspiring Filipino writers. So just to show a very humble appreciation for accepting our invitation, the University of San Carlos Cebuano Studies Center presents this certificate of appreciation to Cecilia Manguerra Brainard for her lecture entitled Ubec, Cebu Reimagined during the Vicente Sotto Lecture Series 2022, given this 19th day of February 2022 via Zoom, signed by the Director of the Cebuano Studies Center and the Vice President for Academic Affairs. Thank you very much, Ms. Cecilia. And there are some feedbacks here from Ms. Susan Evangelista. Thank you, Cecilia. Love this. Thanks for all good questions.
Thank you very much.
That's wonderful to hear. I have one more thing to say, but also before I do that, maybe the viewers would like to have a quick pagwapa session while listening to me speak, because we're hoping to have a picture later on. We'll ask you all to turn on your videos. So maybe you would like to just, I don't know, or basin guapa na already naturally. Okay, so just the last thing I have to say is I'd like to remind everyone one last time that there is an evaluation form in the chat box so that you can avail of your certificate of participation for this event. All right, and then we go to the picture. So may I request everyone, please, it would be so wonderful if you could all turn on your videos so Ms. Cecilia can see who she was speaking with, and we can have a remembrance for this wonderful lecture.
Okay, so I will be taking the picture. Let me just change the settings. Okay. All right. Wait a second. I have to open my snip tool. Okay, everyone, smile please. The count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the next, once again, please. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, and we should thank also our very the whole time our interpreter Mario Kagomok. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so thank you, Miss Cecilia. Thank you very much. We've
everyone.
reached the end of our program.
Thank you, Cebuana Studies Center, for having me. When the pandemic lets up and I'm in Cebu, I will visit you. You seem to have a wonderful place.
The lecture series, and we hope to see you in the succeeding.
Okay, I think our MC got cut off, but also as an announcement, no, we're having another upcoming project with Miss Cecilia, funded by the NCCA. So we hope that will also be coming out soon, and you can listen more about her life, her novels, and also how she writes, her writing practice.
Okay, thank you so much, Miss Cecilia, and thank you, viewers, for being here. How wonderful. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we hope to see you in the next lectures.
Bye.
Goodbye.
I'm buntag ninyo, may gabi na mi dire. Bye.
Bye.
Next time. We'll see you again.